Not too long ago, I was on a plane flying from Seattle to Los Angeles, and as soon as the plane took off, this baby in the back started crying. And I fly a lot, and I've heard my fair share of crying babies, but this one was superlative. Like from the moment the wheels left the tarmac, at full blast, there was this nonstop, blood-curdling screaming coming from the back of the plane. And it just kept on going, and as we were climbing up, people started looking around nervously. Was the mother hurting the baby? What's going on? And as we were all strapped in our seats, the flight attendant was facing us, and she was just kind of giving sympathetic looks to us. And finally, we hit 10,000 feet. The flight attendant got on the speaker and said, well, you may now use your approved electronic devices, and if you happen to have noise-canceling headphones, well, congratulations. So the whole plane erupted with laughter. The baby kept screaming, and then the flight attendant, like, under her belt, and walked down the aisle, and I don't know what she did, but as quickly as the screaming started, there was silence. And I think at first I thought, oh my God, she killed the baby. But she looked like the kind of flight attendant who'd been doing this for decades, so I'm sure it was some sort of Jedi mind trick. But I didn't bother turning back to see what she had done. But all of us on the plane just kind of had this collective sigh of relief, and we just enjoyed the droning of the engines as we ascended. And so while I did that, I took out my Kindle and I started reading this book called The New Culture of Learning by Thomas and Brown. And this is a fascinating book because it aligns with a lot of the ideas and conclusions that I'm presenting today. And even though it's not about design in particular, they apply to a lot of the thinking about design and design education. And before I begin, just for full disclosure, for almost 8 years of my career, I used to work here, not in this building, but here at Microsoft. But for the past year, I've been working at this consultancy called Artifact, where we do lots of cool and fun things. One of the things I do as part of my job is just help the company articulate its vision. And we've chosen this very modest name for our vision, and we call it 21st Century Design. And the gist of this vision is pretty simple, that we have to live differently in the 21st century. And in doing so, we have to design differently as well. So this vision is actually a comprehensive critique of design, not only as it affects individuals, but also our ecology, our profession, and different aspects of society. And one of those aspects that I'm going to talk about today is design education. Now, in my spare time, I teach design at the University of Washington as an affiliate faculty member. So when Jenny called me up and said, hey, August, you want to talk about design and technology and education? I said, sure. So I share, it's really interesting having a foot in each of these worlds. And one advantage is my proponents say that I could be a pragmatic intellectual or an intellectual pragmatist, but there's no Sophie's choice here. I love shipping products. I mean, that's what I'll choose at the end of the day. But the thing is, being in both of these worlds also provides lots of ammunition for my detractors as well. So in the product world, I hear words like academic or philosophical, and we know that the subtext of that is impractical and useless. And then in the academic world, I hear commercial and showy, and that means, you know, thoughtless and vulgar. But at the end of the day, what can you do? Haters gonna hate. So. But my whole career, I've been obsessed with these gray areas, these kind of overlaps where different ideas kind of merge and persist. And so not only with business and academia, but also design and technology, hardware and software, industrial and graphic design, and more conceptual ideas like public and private, modernism, postmodernism, and so forth. The gray area I'm going to talk about today is the gray area that we're all living in between the 20th century and the 21st century. And to help me explain that, I want to talk a little bit about zombies. Now, let me take a really quick poll. Just by show of hands, how many people here have thought of, for more than just a few seconds, about their zombie apocalypse contingency plan? See, yeah. It's a non-trivial number. And it raises the question, well, why is that? Why are we spending, like, why are we thinking about these things? Well, when we think about zombies as a cultural phenomenon, it's pretty recent. They first started appearing in media in the late 19th century, and they really became well known through the 1968 film Night of the Living Dead. And it's kind of appropriate that this became popularized in the late 60s, because this was another really turbulent time in history with issues around race and gender, and politics, and so forth. But the subtext of any sort of zombie apocalypse scenario is this, that civilization is a very fragile thing. And so the other thing is we have to think about what zombies represent, what they symbolize, because they're neither living nor dead. They are both living and dead. So they present this kind of hybrid, this kind of heightened state of ambiguity. And by the way, vampires do too. And so like the traditional stories of vampires, the whole point was like you kill the vampire. And what that symbolizes is it ends this ambiguity, it forces the society to decide, and it returns the story to a sense of stability. And in thinking about this in cultural terms, we often find references to our cultural psyche, our collective consciousness, in the way relationships are portrayed in the media. So if we look at our vampire stories today in the 21st century, it's not about killing the vampire, but it's about living with the vampire, maybe falling in love. And then we have things like werewolves and more zombies, and there's this cartoon on Adult Swim, about this psychiatrist in New York whose roommate is a zombie. But the message that all these stories suggest is that in the 21st century, we must learn to live with the ambiguity of constant change. And in doing so, we can find comfort and maybe even happiness. So in a nutshell, the 20th century is about fighting change and striving for stability. And in the 21st century, it's about embracing change. And embracing change is interesting, especially in regard to design education. And if you take this principle and extrapolate it out, it actually reveals a myth about design education, and perhaps education in general. And here it is. It's that teaching is not necessary for learning. And you can build an entire model around this idea. In the 21st century education, design education, you don't really need teachers, you don't need books, you don't need classrooms. This happens well beyond the school and persists through our careers and our lives. And by the way, it's not just for designers, it's for everyone. So I'm not making an argument for abandoning formal design education. I'm not up here to whine about it either. Rather, I'm proposing that we challenge 20th century assumptions about how we learn design and think about a new model for doing so. And this is a model not just for the classroom, but for the workplace and the studio as well. And there are three aspects to this kind of model: the social, the personal, and the technological. And I'll begin with the social. Back in the day, there was something called the Atelier model. And the social dynamic of the Atelier model is pretty effective. There's the master and the apprentice. And there's a lot of evidence that shows one-on-one learning or learning within a small group is really effective. And the staying power of this model shows that the Atelier model persisted from the Middle Ages well into the 19th century. But there's a problem with this, especially in terms of being modern, that it doesn't scale. And so in the late 19th century, well into the 20th century, we introduced something called a more mechanistic model, which we're more familiar with. This is the teacher and the student. But there's another myth that's happening here, that this is a kind of linear structure where education begins at one point and then there's this destination, and it's thought of in steps. And not only that, that in each increment of these steps, that the goal is to kind of get the knowledge. And this is thoroughly tested, and the kind of overall theme of this linear model of education is efficiency. I'd argue in the 21st century that this model shifts to something more environmental. In other words, the social dynamic is the balance between very well-chosen constraints and the ability for people within those two constraints to act with complete freedom. And the tension between these two forces also aligns with the classic definition of play. And one thing that Jay pointed out earlier is that in such an environment, failure is absolutely acceptable. In fact, it's requisite for learning. And there are indications that this model has staying power. Because if we think about mechanisms in this old model, mechanisms can be broken, but environments cannot. And there are two outlasting effects of this. The first is that it forces us not to think about how to fix an environment, but rather it poses the question, well, how can we improve the conditions for design to happen? And secondly, it shifts our thinking from designing for the world to designing within it. And the second aspect of this is around personal agency. And personal agency long ago, there's the whole idea of the lone designer holed up in the studio, unveiling works of genius. And then in the 20th century, there's this focus around community. And I'd argue in the 21st century, there's a shift. And it's a shift from community to the collective. And collectives are embodied mostly in digital ways through websites, blogs, wikis, and so forth. And you might be saying to yourself, hey, wait a second, those are community tools. But there's a slight distinction between a community and a collective. The communities are vertical, hierarchical, status-driven structures. And while at face value, collectives might seem similar, they're actually flat, horizontal, decentralized, and highly democratized. Now, there's analogies of technologies that exist today that show this shift from this verticality to this horizontality. And we see it in terms of TV, radio, and encyclopedias shifting to YouTube, Spotify, Wikipedia. And in terms of learning, I guess one way to encapsulate the notion of a collective is it enables peer-to-peer learning. So in the sense that communities derive its strength from a sense of belonging, collectives, on the other hand, derives their strength from participation. And some other features of collectives is that they allow people to come and go as they please. It allows people to contribute individual knowledge. And here's what's scary. They can't be driven or controlled. That's a very 20th century idea. And the trade-off for this is that collectives enjoy the advantage of unlimited scale. So in short, for communities, people learn in order to belong, but in collectives, people belong in order to learn. Finally, I'd like to talk about the evolution of technology as it relates to design. And back in the day, we could set up two little camps. One is there used to be handmade design, and at the other end, we shifted to machine-made. So it's kind of like hand lettering versus cut metal. And then in the 20th century, we shifted from the machine-made analog to the machine-made digital. So there was the literal cutting and pasting to Command X, Command V. And I'd argue in the 21st century, we're going to make another shift from what I call the handmade digital to the machine-made digital. In other words, we're going to move from using the mouse, the pen, and touch to crafting algorithms. And the implication of this is that, yes, designers will need to learn how to code. Calm down, hello. So it's really about using code as a design tool, not with the intent of replacing the role of developers and engineers. And the other interesting thing about this is if I said 30 years ago, every designer will have to know how to use a computer. It seems kind of laughable, but I'd argue it wouldn't take that long for this reality to take place. I'd like to show a little example of how this model kind of worked. Last winter at the University of Washington, I taught a course that I called Algorithmic Visual Communications Design. And there were 22 seniors and one grad student visiting from another department. And with a couple of exceptions, there was little to no programming knowledge among the class. We had 10 weeks, and we were going to explore the use of algorithms as a tool for visual communications design. And in doing so, we engaged the language called processing by Ben Fry and Casey Reese. I encourage all of you to take a look. And here's how it played out. First, we set up one of these kind of playful environments where there was just a modicum of constraints. But within it, we allowed for complete freedom to exercise within these constraints. And in fact, if I could have done away with the whole notion of grades, I would have. But even the concept of cheating was kind of revisited in the sense that everything was open. Anyone could access their computer, the books at any given time. And for the first half of the course, we just explored the basics of object-oriented programming. And there was encouragement to participate in the wealth of collectives around algorithmic design. And for the second half of the course, there was a sense of autonomous engagement with the technology. And I want to show 3 examples from the class. The first is, and keep in mind these projects were done in 4 weeks. The first is this video game called Stranded that James Davidson did. And it's kind of an homage to 8-bit video games, but he coded and developed an entire video game in 4 weeks. And it's about an astronaut that's crashed on a planet, and he has to pick up these modules to save his ship. Here's a little bit from that reel. All right, you get the idea. But it was actually a complete game, and I said to James, well, it's obvious you've been doing this a while because you cranked this out in just a few weeks. And he said, no, 10 weeks ago, I'd never written a line of code in my life. The second example is from a student named Lola Migas. And she was interested, along with her friend Ryan Diaz, about visualizing qualities of poetry and prose. And so what they did is they created a visualization algorithm for different pieces of writing according to the lexical qualities of the pieces. So on the left here, you'll see a Robert Frost poem. On the right is a haiku. So you can kind of see the difference. And from left to right, this is a Shakespearean sonnet. In the middle is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And on the right is the Gettysburg Address. And then the final example is something called Front Page Fingerprint by Derek Chan. And what he did is he took the front page of the New York Times for a month, and he created histograms according to the amount of any particular color. So you can see most of the New York Times is mostly white, but then it gets really interesting as you get into the smaller colors. That spring, his poster won a design award, but I think the most exciting piece of recognition was that Nick Felton of Feltron Reports blogged it. So this is just a small example of how those 3 aspects manifested itself in a kind of 21st century design classroom. So you might be asking yourself, well, how's this relevant to me and what can I do? So here's what you can do, 3 simple things. The first is to construct an environment for you and your team which have carefully chosen constraints and to allow absolute freedom within those constraints. The second is to introduce as many opportunities for peer-to-peer learning as possible, both within and outside of design. And finally, it's to acknowledge the evolution of design from the handmade digital to the algorithmic. Because as Alvin Toffler, the futurist, said, that the illiterate of the future will not be the person who cannot read. Instead, it'll be the person who cannot learn. Thank you very much.